Yeah. So please start.
Ji, thank you, sir. Very good afternoon to all of you. I'm Dr. Ritu Sekhri, and I will be taking your CFT paper number 2, that is Mental Health and Disorders. I hope my voice is audible to all.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. So, we will be discussing the mental health, which is the current topic of today's time. In fact, during these lockdown days, this has been of prime importance that we have to be very careful towards our mental health. So WHO has defined mental health. I mean, before we define this mental health, we must know what is actually health. So health incorporates physical, mental, and social well-being, right? So if we have to define mental health, it means it is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work with productively and fruitfully. And of course, above beyond that, not just that he should be healthy and able to deal with his stress, but must make a valuable contribution to his or her community. Now, what is mental illness? Health is something that we have discussed the positive aspects. When I'm saying mental illness, it means negative aspect. Now, this can be, like in purely sociological terms, as a deviation from socially approved standards. Like, mental illness has been defined from various aspects. One can be a sociological aspect, like when there's a deviation from socially approved standards of interpersonal behavior, or it can be like an inability to perform one's sanctioned social roles. Therefore, in social science literature, it is agreed that mental illness refers to dysfunctional interpersonal behavior. And that can be because of any reason, your family problems, marital discord, or parent child relationship. Right. It can also be defined as an illness with psychological or behavioral manifestation. Sorry. Or impairment in functioning. Now, that functioning can be due to social, psychological, or that impairment rather in functioning can be due to social, psychological, it can be genetical, physical, or biological disturbances. And this happens to be an approved definition from American Psychiatric Association. And time and again, I'm going to talk about this particular association, that is American Psychiatric Association, because when we are talking about mental disorders, we cannot ignore the role of this association, which has really helped us to or helped us in diagnosing different kind of disorders. Now, there are more than six characteristics, but I'm going to discuss the common six characteristics that reflect the person as mentally healthy. It can be having a sense of mastery on the environment. When you have the undistorted perception of reality, then there is some sense of integration in what you do, what you think, and what you feel. Then there's also autonomy, that is a freedom. Then growth or your self development. Of course, self development is very important. Your ideal self or your real self, we can say, where you are aware about your emotions, your regulations, and then, of course, self actualization, reaching the highest transcendent stage where you are not following the rules or the laws of the society just because you have to abide them, but you believe in them to be right in the righteous manner. That's called a self-actualization stage. And of course, one more important characteristic of a mentally healthy individual is the kind of attitude you hold towards yourself, positive, negative, or neutral. Then there are different models of mental illness given, and every model has its own assumption defining mental illness. Now, I'm going to discuss few models here, and the brief glance of those models, I'm just going to name them. If you wish, you can write them. Spiritual model, moral character model, the statistical model, the biological model, psychological models, psychosocial model, the social model, family therapy model, and biopsychosocial model. So one by one, I'm going to discuss few points that we can discuss in each and every model. Now, the first is the oldest explanatory model that we call as spiritual model. When you are said that your deeds, your actions, your negative behaviors, they're all attributed to karma theory. So, from a traditional spiritual perspective, conscientiousness, or you can say consciousness, is seen as resulting from some supernatural force. There was a time when psychology was defined as the study of soul. So, from that historical aspect. Now, there is a religious narrative in spiritual model that explains that there are good and bad forces in the world, and that suffering is a function of either being possessed by the bad, so here bad means the evil spirit, or through the idea that the afflicted have fallen out of favor with the good. Now, this generally occurs because of the sin or some related concept of immoral behavior that leads to some kind of badness or contamination. So is person defined as mentally ill from spiritual model. कि आप जो भी हैं, जो भी आपके अंदर बैडनेस या some kind of contamination देखी जा रही है, it is the result of supernatural force. So you are being treated with that kind of force only. बुरा करेंगे तो बुरा पाएंगे. So that was the spiritual model. Next is the moral character model. So in a nutshell, if I have to define moral character model, there are certain virtues which one must learn, right? Such as courage, honesty, integrity, compassion, and grace. So such values enable us to live the admirable life. So this model says if you don't have such values, you are being identified as mentally ill. So these are the different explanations. Then we have a statistical model, something calculative kind of a thing. Now this model is basically derived from mathematics than from psychology, I must say. And the statistical model concentrates on the definition of abnormality actually. So the statistical model, they try to find out what is the difference between being normal and abnormal. So abnormality is any substantial deviation from a statistically calculated average, which means those who fall in the golden mean. कहने का भाव क्या है? Those who do what most people do are normal. So when you have that compliant behavior, जो बाकी majority कर रही है, आप उन्हीं के साथ है, you are being identified as you are normal. So when you are deviating from that normal continuum, you are not doing what the majority of other people are doing, you are being called as so and so person is abnormal. Of course, one thing more I want to add here, maybe something which is normal for you can be abnormal for me and can be vice versa. उल्टा भी हो सकता है. Why? क्योंकि हमारी जो deviation है, मेरी जो choice है behavior को लेके, that's going to be different. And why? Because we have individual differences. We live in a society where we all are wired up with not just genetic but the environmental factors also. So can be a reason that I can have a different viewpoint towards the world and you can have a different viewpoint. Now, after the statistical model, there is another model called as medical model. A medical model जो है, it attributes the mental abnormalities to physiological, biochemical और genetic causes. So हम medical model में almost ये तीन चीजें पढ़ेंगे. And they attempt to treat these abnormalities by way of medically grounded procedures. जैसे कि drug therapy, इसको हम psychopharmacology भी बोलते हैं. Maybe ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, or some kind of brain surgery. So brain surgery is called as psychosurgery. Now, as I said, medical model attributes this mental abnormality to physiological, biochemical, and genetic causes. So the genetic models of mental disorder, now they suggest that psychopathology is inherited from parents. And there is certainly evidence from the families, like different transmission of many disorders, for example, depression, schizophrenia, and many other mental disorders like anxiety. So they tend to run in families. When you look into the genetic model, you are going to find the evidences. For example, monozygotic twins. एक twin को है तो दूसरे के chances ज़्यादा हैं rather than dizygotic. Then the biological parents, adopted parents. Closer the relative, then more the chances कि उस relative में same disorder की vulnerability देखी जाए. Neuro imaging is also a kind of a technique that falls under this medical model only. So in neuro imaging, we held structural changes in different parts of the brain as responsible for mental illness. अब ये structural changes हो सकता है कि volumetric changes हो सकता है आपका जो cortex है, there is a reduction in the volume or can be enlarged ventricles in that part. So I won't say that this structural changes are the sufficient cause, but they can be one of the contributory factor behind the causation of illness. Then neurobiology. So basically in neurobiology, the belief is that the human is an organism that consists of natural functions designed by nature. And the mental illness is the breakdown of such functions. कौन से functions? The natural selection operating on genetics. So just like a heart attack is a biological disease characterized by the breakdown of the functioning of circulatory system, similarly, mental illnesses, they also stems from malfunctioning of neurophysiological processes. So enough of biological models discussed. Now an attempt shall be made to focus on the psychological models. And in psychological models, we will discuss the psychodynamic model, the behavioral model, the cognitive behavioral model, and the humanistic or the existential model. Now the psychological model. तो जो explanation है mental illness की, that will be in psychological nature. So this model attempts to define mental illness like the individual. He develops along a path and attempts to adapt to their environment. So when he fails to learn certain crucial elements that are existing in the society, or learns the wrong responses to new situations, or adopt short-term solutions that can have long-term maladaptive consequences, of course, we will consider him as suffering from one or the other kind of an illness. So if we have to go by this kind of an explanation that falls under the psychological model, we will first discuss the psychodynamic model. And here in psychodynamic model, the emphasis is that the root cause of all our illnesses, mental illnesses, is the unconscious mind. As Freud has discussed the topographical aspect of mind in three parts, saying conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. So conscious means you're all are aware. Right now you know your class is going on. Subconscious can be you have to retrieve from your long-term memory, maybe a birthday, sorry, from your short-term memory, maybe a birthday of your friend, a phone number, or any relative aspect. So you can easily pull it out. Now, the unconscious, that's a storehouse of all unpleasant memories that you don't want them to come into your conscious level. You have yourself repressed them with the help of certain defense mechanisms. And why are you doing it? Because you have to protect yourself, your ego. Now, why do you want to protect your ego or yourself? Because otherwise, if you get conscious about your unpleasant memories, you are going to have an anxiety attack. And you don't want to get into that attack. So we may use defense mechanisms, or else we will try not to bring the unconscious material in our conscious mind. So the psychodynamic model says that the problems are determined by the history of person's prior emotional experience. Now, if I say prior emotional experience, matlab childhood ones, and purposely negative childhood experiences. So that can be a one lead to identify the presence of mental illness in an individual. But nevertheless, when I'm saying unconscious mind, what is mind? An abstract concept. We know what is brain. Where is mind? How does it look like? So it's like something that, हम abstract form में बात कर रहे हैं. Therefore, behaviorists, they were not in favor to go for this kind of explanation, because they believed in observation or what is overtly observable. So then there came the behavioral model to explain what is mental illness. And this system believed that the only or the study of directly observable behavior, the stimuli, the reinforcing conditions that control it, could serve as a basis for understanding human behavior. It can be normal or abnormal. मतलब कि बिहेवियर को नॉर्मल या एबनॉर्मल कैटेगरी में डिफाइन करने से पहले कुछ ऑपरेशनल लेवल पे होना चाहिए, राइट? यू हैव टू एक्ट. Some action should be there. And for that action, you must have some kind of stimulus around you. And then maybe certain kind of conditions which can be positively reinforcing you or negatively reinforcing you to repeat the same behavior. And then we can find out whether that behavior is adaptive or maladaptive. So when I'm talking about observable behavior, stimuli, reinforcing conditions, it means the role of learning is very important from the behavioral aspect. And certainly that can be one reason that if you get conditioned to certain kind of maladaptive behavior, you can also be deconditioned to develop adaptive responses in yourself. So it's not that difficult as we are thinking from the psychodynamic point of view. क्योंकि हमें लगता है psychodynamic, if I try to bring anything on my conscious level, I am going to suffer more. But the behavioral models say it's not that tough. Because certainly few things you have learned in the environment and you can unlearn them in the same situation with the different kind of stimuli or the reinforcing conditions. So going one step ahead than the behavioral model. Now the thing was, in behavioral model, we are not thinking actually. We are just focusing on the actions or maybe something which is observable, right? Rationality is missing to some extent. So we prefer to develop cognitive behavioral model because certainly what you do is like you have already given a thought. So you think, you have certain kind of emotions, feelings for that thinking pattern, and then you enact, which means the problematic area is your dysfunctional thinking that can lead to a mental disorder. So the cognitive model understands mental disorder as being the result of the biases in your thinking. तभी हम बोलते हैं ना, why have you developed negative thinking? Why do you think so negative? You must give some, a chance or a seed of a torch or a ray of light where you can see your life from another aspect also. So it explains the thoughts and the information processing can become distorted at times. That leads to maladaptive emotions and behavior. For example, here I'm going to quote a very, very simple example. Let's suppose late night we get a call. You're sleeping around 2 or 3 o'clock. You get a call. So कुछ भी ध्यान में आने से पहले the first thing you have is, I hope everything is okay. Who's calling me इतना late? And if you see the number and then depends the kind of connection you have, maybe from your mom, your dad, your friend, you are connected to. And the first thing you have, कभी नहीं ये होगा कि वो मेरा हालचाल पूछने के लिए फोन कर रहा है. The first thing is, ठीक हो सब. Because this is how our schemas or our thinking has been wired up. We can also think, okay, maybe he missed out something and there can be some other thing which is as important as he couldn't wait for the son to come and that's the reason he's calling me. So what happened? You have some kind of a belief pattern. You operate on that belief pattern that generates a kind of emotion which is negative, fearful, and you act accordingly. Now the another model after cognitive behavior model, because we have focused on thoughts, your thinking patterns, rationalization in cognitive behavior model. Here in humanistic model, we see mental health problems as a signal that an individual is failing to reach his or her potential. So when an individual is failing to reach his or her potential, his or her psychological growth has stopped. For example, you're very good in music, but your parents, they have forced you. I'm just giving an example of an adolescent girl or a boy. So you've been forced to take up medicine or engineering or some other field, but you are very, very good in music. I'm sure you will do well in the other field also, but your real self is somewhere or the other thwarted, threatened. So you will grow, you will definitely make money like anything, but a kind of yourself is being missing. Then this humanistic perspective, it views human nature as basically good. Now, this humanistic perspective says all human beings are good by nature. It's just the situation that's going to make you bad or good. Also, it emphasizes the present conscious processes. मतलब again, जो साइकोडायनामिक में अनकॉन्शियस प्रोसेसेस की बात करी गई है वो यहाँ पे भी उसको अटेंशन नहीं दिया गया. Not even the past causes, like your past relationship. Humanistic model says, I'm going to focus on your present. Nothing to be discussed about your childhood experiences or your unconscious, unmet needs or motives. Similarly, in this model, or this model says that the person has an inherent capacity for the responsible self-direction. You can direct yourself. ऐसा कुछ भी नहीं है. एंड इसी ह्यूमनिस्टिक मॉडल से कार्ल रॉजर्स की जो क्लाइंट सेंटर्ड थेरेपी डेवलप हुई थी. So client centered itself means the focus is on the client, not on the therapist. So the therapist acts just as a torchlight, right? And you are going to have the solution for your own problems. We are going to talk about it, discuss it, put an insight on it, and then you can come up with your own solutions. Which means, like this model, it emphasizes growth and self-actualization rather than curing the diseases or alleviating the disorders. So once you have your growth, once you feel the self-actualization in yourself, once you have developed that empathy, the congruence between your real self and the ideal self, I believe you will be free from all such kind of mental disorders. I hope all the students are connected to me, right? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Hello?
ma'am.
All right, all right. Now, the another model is the social model. We have discussed the cognitive, humanistic, behavioral, and the psychodynamic model. Now we are focusing on the social model. So we have discussed the genetics, the biochemical processes, the unconscious material. So here in this model, society is very important. The social structure, which imposes the restrictions on the behavior. सिमिलरली जिस तरह से बायोलॉजिकल इनहेरिटेंस है उसी तरह से हमारा सोशल स्ट्रक्चर भी हमारे ऊपर कुछ रिस्ट्रिक्शंस इंपोज करता है. And the effect of social conditions on mental illness, we need to understand that before we explain the individual distress and how then that distress be related to the larger force or to a community level. Which means that the social forces are very important or the most important determinant for mental disorder. Then the social model, it does not argue that people should not be held responsible for their behavior because they are victims of society. But then, you know, there are certain rules, laws, जो कि frame करे गए हैं so that we can exhibit ourselves in a civilized manner. Because we all have that rational, we are called as rational human beings. Logical, the thinking, the reasoning we have developed. We are no more like wild animals. But at the same time, if these restrictions are not there in the society, of course, हम शायद एनिमल से भी एक लोअर कैटेगरी में अगर उस वक्त हमें एक्ट करना हो तो हम कर सकते हैं और वो हम आए दिन देखते हैं. रिसेंट एग्जाम्पल जो एक फीमेल एलिफेंट जिसके साथ जो एक ह्यूमन बीइंग ने करा है बिहेव, सो वो कहीं ना कहीं एक हीनियस एक्ट ही है और हम वो कह ही नहीं सकते कि एक ह्यूमन बीइंग ने, हम सोच ही नहीं सकते, एक्सपेक्ट नहीं कर सकते कुछ ऐसा भी हो सकता है. Now, what about the psychosocial model? If we are saying that society, social forces are very important, it means society ke liye we need to understand the environment also, because we don't exist in a vacuum. So when there are social factors, automatically psychological factors भी आएंगे, environmental factors भी आएंगे, और शायद जो ये जो psychological factors हैं जो अभी मैं फिलहाल डिस्कस कर रही हूँ, they are like the developmental influences, right? So कभी कभार होता है हमारा जो growth या development है वो fully develop नहीं हो पाता है, and it may handicap a person psychologically, making him or her less resourceful. So maybe that can be one reason for developing that mental illness, because the current person is not able to cope with the social events. So the psychosocial factors that I'm talking about, they fall under 4 basic categories. One can be early deprivation or a trauma. कोई setback हो सकता है, कोई incident ऐसा हो सकता है. Second can be inadequate parenting styles. I think that plays a very important role. Controlling parents, controlling children. Maybe you are using a very strict kind of a parenting style or a very liberal, laissez-faire जिसे हम बोलते हैं. We are not even bothered. So something like in between, like democratic, हमें थोड़ा parenting style use करना पड़ता है बच्चों के साथ भी, where you also have the involvement and kids are also involved. Then the third psychosocial factor can be marital discord or divorce. Then the maladaptive peer relationship. So once a child, an individual steps out of his or her family, the second kind of a relationship is the peer, friends, जहाँ से सब गैंग कल्चर और गैंग कल्चर बच्चों में डेवलप होता है, ग्रुप्स इमर्ज होते हैं. And of course, the social learning model. Now, if we are saying that early deprivation, parenting styles, marital discord and divorce, and interpersonal relationships are held responsible for developing mental illness, this means family therapy model is also important, right? And mental illness, according to family therapy model, is because of the pathological family processes, lack of cohesion, excess of conflict, right? Unhealthy interpersonal relationships, maybe rejection, not accepting your children or your family or your parents, and then they have their own fights. So all of these reasons can be held responsible for developing a mental disorder. Now, this family therapy usually begins as an approach that encourages all members of the family to work together. So when we talk about the family therapy model, this is because we want the conflict to be resolved, and then to identify and change the relationships wherever it is necessary. So we have to focus on family interactions, especially the alignment and the discord. And then from the engagement or disengagement of different group members. बच्चों में जो sibling rivalry है, how parents are, whether they are able to handle such kind of rivalries or not. Do they have enough time to devote or not? Then biopsychosocial model. Now this model integrates your biological, social, psychological, including cognitive and behavioral aspect. And this believes that abnormality is caused by the interaction of all these factors, not just any one cause. And relative importance of each factor depends on the individual and of course the environment. So ऐसा नहीं है कि biological मतलब सारे ही biological factors नजर आएंगे एक individual में. We have to see आपका geographical location, your demographic background, the kind of upbringing you have, the family environment, the school environment, everything, the community you live in, all these factors play an important role. That's why it is being called as biopsychosocial model. And they defined mental illness as a kind of predisposition or a diathesis vulnerable model in which you have that vulnerability or a tendency to develop a disorder, but you will not be able to until and unless there is some kind of stressor that triggers the manifestation. So ऐसा नहीं है कि if I talk about healthy genes or unhealthy genes, या अगर हम इम्यूनिटी की बात करें, जैसे आजकल कोरोना को लेकर सब लोग ये बोल रहे हैं कि जिनका इम्यूनिटी स्ट्रांग है, दे हैव लेसर चांसेस टू डेवलप कोरोना, व्हिच मींस वल्नरेबल सब हैं. अब डिपेंड्स कि आपका कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन कैसा है, your body constitution, your environment, the food you eat, the thoughts you keep. So all these factors play important role. Similarly, even for your mental illness, physiological, sociocultural, your genetic predisposition, all matters before you develop a disorder. Now, as we are discussing normal, abnormal mental illness, we must know a slight classification of abnormal behavior from 4 different aspects. Okay, if I'm saying, okay, this is abnormal, so you are going to ask me, then what is normal? If you say person who's different in size, shape, weight, different or deviating. Now here the classification says that if we have to define abnormal behavior, then it means there can be a deviation from statistical norms. For example, IQ. So less than 70, mental retardation. We know this. So I'm going to call that person. Of course, अब हम उसको mental retardation नहीं, intellectual disability बोलते हैं, because we fear labeling kids or students or children with such sensitive words. So now we call as intellectually disabled. Initially, it was called as mental retardation. So the one classification is deviation from statistical norms, deviation from social norms. You call it as like violation of some rule. Okay, the best example, vandalism. Scratching someone's car, writing something on, going as a public property को आप खराब कर रहे हैं. So you are deviating from your social norms. Yes, you are abnormal. You can't do this. Third, maladaptiveness of behavior. कैसे? For example, an alcoholic who drinks so heavily that he cannot keep his job. So this maladaptiveness depicts abnormality. Personal distress. Personal distress when you don't have your ideal mental health and is affecting your well-being. Now, apart from this kind of classification, we have some standard measures to identify abnormal behaviors or mental disorders, a higher term I'm going to call now. क्योंकि एक वक्त था जब हमारे पास कुछ क्लासिफिकेशन मटेरियल या मेथोडोलॉजी अवेलेबल नहीं थी, तो वर्ल्ड हेल्थ ऑर्गेनाइजेशन ने एक इंटरनेशनल स्टैटिस्टिकल क्लासिफिकेशन ऑफ डिजीजेस, इंजरीज एंड कॉजेज ऑफ डेथ एक वर्जन निकाला था. आप उसको बाइबल ही बोल सकते हो. लॉन्ग टाइम बैक की मैं बात कर रही हूँ. तो पहले इवन साइकियाट्रिस्ट भी वही फॉलो करते थे. इसको हम आईसीडी बोलते थे. बट देन लेटर few health workers realize that ना चाहते हुए भी हम साइकोलॉजिकल प्रॉब्लम्स को फिजियोलॉजिकल लेवल पे डिस्कस करके छोड़ रहे थे कि नहीं, there is no psychological problem, it's biological. But then कुछ disorders ऐसे सामने आए जहां biologically, physiologically person was fit and fine, but then there was some kind of deviation. So working on it and sorting out something pure psychological or psychiatric in nature, we came up with Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. इसका short form है DSM और otherwise इसको हम बोलते हैं Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, developed by American Psychiatric Association. So this new Bible for psychiatrists, it provides the common language, a standard criteria for the classification of mental disorder. So in this manual, there are different codes developed over the years. 1952 से शुरू हुआ था ये DSM. First version, second version, third version, text revision, fourth and then fifth. अभी हम fifth follow कर रहे हैं, जो कि 2013 में आया था. So every version of this diagnostic manual has one or the other kind of a revision. If you remember, there was a time when sexual orientation, especially this homosexual relationships, were considered as sin and abnormal. And nowadays, they are fully accepted. And even when you are filling up a form, तो वहाँ पे जब हम gender define करते हैं, तो एक नया category add हो चुका है, that's transgender. So we have all of us some way or the other accepted with it. Why? Because it's no more called as a sin or something evil or abnormal. So I'll quickly go through the history of DSM. The first DSM, DSM-1, established in 1952, and the owners were the psychoanalytics. They wanted to distinguish the groups of psychoneurotic disorders such as anxiety. Then in 1968, of course, psychoanalysis still dominated during this period, 1950 or 1960 में. तो जो psychoneurotic problems कहा जाती थी DSM-1 में, वो DSM-2 में आके neurotic disturbances कहलानी शुरू हो गई. Then in 1973, homosexuality was removed and it was replaced by sexual orientation disturbance. Then DSM-3 in 1980. There were completely new directions in psychiatry during this DSM-3. Instead of symptoms, they defined them as symbols. They were viewed as natural disease categories. So हुआ क्या था? Again DSM-3 में they were returning to the world of medicine actually. Then DSM-3R, capital R revised in 1987. DSM-3R आया. And there was an addition of self-defeating personality disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and this was actually introduced to account for that repeated trauma in Vietnam veterans. तो ये इसलिए PTSD ये introduce किया गया था. Then in 1994, DSM-4. Neurosis no longer in existence and mental disorders include किए गए. And if I tell you, the number of disorders were increased with every revised version. For example, DSM-2 में 85 disorders थे. DSM-3 में 265 disorders. DSM-3R 292 disorders. DSM-4 297 disorders. Then we had DSM-4 TR, T for toy, TRR revision. Now this DSM-4 TR जो कि 2000 में आया था, year 2000 में, बहुत ही कम minor changes थी इसमें. They introduced the multi-axial classification system. So axis में उन्होंने disorders को classify करना शुरू करा, जिसमें कि पहला axis जो था, axis 1, it lists the majority of mental disorders. जितने भी mental disorders उस category में थे, वो axis 1 में include करे गए. Axis 2 was reserved for personality disorders. And Axis 3 was designed to present general medical information. Then Axis 4 was given to present specific information about the client's current psychosocial environment. Now, a large number of global categories of problems are being suggested in the DSM text. And in fact, practitioners जो होते हैं, they are encouraged to include specific information in one way or the other. So we always encourage to add global characterizations in DSM. So this multi-axial system, also this DSM-4TR, developed one more axis, that was axis 5, called as Global Assessment Functioning, GAF, all three in capital. Global Assessment Functioning, GAF, and this was listed on axis 5. Then DSM-5, 2013, the latest edition जो हम use कर रहे हैं. अब इसमें जो changes थे, parts of a psychiatric disorder definition, there were some changes in that. So again, symptoms were the focus. Time and onset was given importance. For example, अगर हम बोलें कि ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, तो उसका जो age onset है वो before age 12 है. So DSM-5 was focusing on symptoms, the time, and दो चीजें और add करी गई थी. One, significant distress or the impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas. Which means, okay, for example, a person is being diagnosed with paranoid personality disorder. So, क्या उस patient में paranoid personality disorder होने के कारण, paranoid मतलब suspicious. So when वो कुछ एक level cross कर जाता है intensity में अपना, तो हम उसको disorder कहते हैं, जो कि हमारा DSM criteria को वो बिल्कुल match करता है. तो which means क्या ये personality disorder is creating significant distress कि उसका social, occupational और जितने भी other important areas है functioning के, क्या उसको भी वो affect कर रहे हैं? Is there any kind of impairment? If that's so, then of course, again a tick mark into that DSM कि yes, person is being diagnosed with this current disorder. And the another important thing that was included was the exclusion criteria. Now, what was the exclusion criteria? Any other medical condition along with the psychological condition. ऐसा तो नहीं है कि it's not just psychological, some other medical condition also exists, or some other psychological condition, we call it as comorbid. So once you have classified the abnormality or the abnormal behavior, we know what is normal, what is abnormal to some extent, and we know that if we have to look into the disorders, or how do we diagnose? So the psychiatrist, they have a Bible that's called as DSM. Now, I'm going to take a common, I won't say disorder, but a common factor, or you can say a response, which is actually being studied by all of us in these current days, that's called stress. Now, what is stress? It's a non-specific response of the body, right? To any demand characterized, अगर physiological condition से देखा जाए तो, it is characterized by the secretion of glucocorticoids. So what is this glucocorticoid? These are actually, you can say, adding some kind of steroid hormones, right? Glucose plus cortex plus steroid hormones, which helps in the regulation of metabolism of glucose. So now when the situation is not in your favor, you can say, or there is some kind of a triggering or a stimuli which triggers you, we can see the manifestation of stress. So there was a physician, Hans Seeley, H-A-N-S, I'm going to repeat it, H-A-N-S, Hans Seeley, S-E-L-Y-E. He was actually basically a pioneer who defined stress as a non-specific response. He developed a concept of general adaptation syndrome, and this is one of a very important model, you can say. So Seeley, he developed this general adaptation syndrome called as GAS, G-A-S. It's not pronounced as gas, but GAS, G-A-S. And he discussed 3 stages of stress. Hota kaise hai? Now, first is the alarm stage. Second is the stage of resistance, where you try with all your coping mechanisms that I have to fight with the stress. And the last stage, that's the exhaustion, where you end up depletion of all the resources, you're left with nothing, and you are collapsed. You are drained all over. Now, this alarm stage, the first one, is called the fight or the flight response. तो जितना भी physiological mechanism है, जैसे your heart beats fast, breathing and perspiration increase हो जाती है, pupils dilate करते हैं, stomach clench कर जाता है, muscles tense up हो जाते हैं. And believe it or not, this is all done by nature to protect you in case something bad happens. So once you come out of the stress, once the stress is removed, your body will go back to your normal conditions. So you have developed that gravity के अक्सर waves की तरह we get into the stress, then we again come back to the normal. So when there is a kind of alarm reaction, the body releases a hormone called as adrenaline. Now this adrenaline tries to fight with the stress and helps you to stay in control. Now once you are being alarmed that there is some kind of stress, there comes another stage that's called the resistance or the adaptation. Resist कर रहे हैं आप. So this is the body's response to long-term protection. अब होता क्या है? It further secretes hormones. So with the secretion of hormones, it increases your blood sugar level. ताकि you maintain that energy level and of course raises your BP. And then there are certain other hormones being secreted. They are called as corticosteroids. And these corticosteroids are being secreted for your resistance reaction. कि आप कैसे अपने आप को उस stressful situation से combat करेंगे, fight करेंगे. Now, overuse by the body's defense mechanism. अगर हम अपने corticosteroids का overuse कर रहे हैं इस stage के दौरान, then this phase eventually leads to disease. Which means if the adaptation phase, ये जो resistance phase है, it continues for a prolonged period of time without any period of relaxation, you will become prone to fatigue, irritability, lethargy, and as the effort to sustain arousal slide into the negative stress. तो वो एक होता है eustress, EUSTRESS, positive. जरूरत भी होती है उसकी. Negative stress, distress. And once that you have reached that suffering stage of जहाँ पे आपका concentration lapse कर रहा है, you are getting into the exhaustion stage. Your body has run out of all the reserves, your energy, your immunity. Then your mental, physical and emotional resources, they suffer heavily. और इस experience को, इस bodily experience को, we call it as adrenal exhaustion. Now in this stage, blood sugar level decrease कर जाएगा. Almost depletion हो जाएगी. You will develop decreased stress tolerance क्योंकि ये काफी देर से चलता आ रहा है ना, chronic बनता जा रहा है. Progressively mental and physical exhaustion, and then finally illness. You will collapse. Now there are certain coping strategies. 3 तरह की coping strategies है that we can use to come up or to cope up from your stress. First is the appraisal focused. Appraisal, APPRAISAL. Appraisal focused strategy. Now this is that strategy when the person modifies the way they think. For example, you are distancing yourself from the problem. So you are trying to alter the way you think about a problem. Maybe you are altering your goals and values. For example, कहीं ना कहीं आप सिचुएशन में थोड़ा सा ह्यूमर क्रिएट कर दें ताकि वो थोड़ा लाइट बन जाए सिचुएशन जो इतना हैवी बना के आपने रखा हुआ है. So here appraisal means your cognitive strategy is working, your thinking processes. Another coping strategy is problem focused. So you are finding out the information on the problem and then learning new skills to manage the problem. तो यहाँ पे भी आपने अपना rational maintain करा हुआ है. No more emotionality, you are strictly focused towards your goal, your problem, and you have to find out a solution. But कभी कभार ये appraisal और problem focused जो strategy है, it's not working. You really need to vent out yourself. You need some kind of catharsis. So you use emotion focused strategy where you release your pent up emotions. You distract yourself for some time. You try to manage your hostile feelings. You meditate, some kind of relaxation technique, yoga, dance, so some form of art therapy. Because you feel that abhi ke liye at present I need to open up myself. I cannot be like too much of logical also makes you like a robot. But you are not a robot, you are a human being and a blend of emotions, rational reasoning, and thoughts. So now I'm going to discuss the three important characteristics of stressful stimuli. क्योंकि हम कह रहे हैं कि there is some kind of a stimuli, a trigger in the environment that poses a stress. So if you are feeling a stress, now the stressor must have certain value. What kind of a value? It should be a conflicted thing. It can be like some uncontrollable factor and overloaded with one or the other dimension which you can't handle as of now, which will help you, not help you exactly, because helping is till the time you are in the alarm stage. But when you are not able to handle the load, then you will fall into the exhaustion stage. Apart from this Hans-Seeley's model, this Hans-Seeley's model also falls into the category of response-based model, right? So it helps to identify the patterns of psychological and physiological responses that occur in different difficult environments. Then we have a stimulus-based model in stress. Now the stimulus-based model, as I said, it focuses on the nature of the stimuli, stressful stimuli. Like, what is that makes certain stimuli stressor? क्या हो सकते हैं stressors हमारे? Like threats to your self-esteem, maybe crowding, maybe group pressure, isolation. For example, a course assignment, right? It may be difficult for someone or maybe overload for someone else. So along with the characteristic of the stimuli, even the individual factors play important role. जरूरी नहीं है कि आपके लिए अगर कोई चीज burden है वो दूसरे के लिए भी हो सकता है वो दूसरे person के लिए exciting हो कि okay, I'm going to give my assignment, और किसी के लिए हो oh my god, I have to prepare it all the way and I have to submit it. There's a deadline. So few of us are going to work under that pressure, and कईयों के लिए वो pressure की requirement नहीं होती है, they work on their ease. Then we also have another model called as interaction model. So this interaction model is a blend of response-based model and the stimuli-based model. So this model focuses on motives and the coping ability, right? So this model says that stress कब होगा? Now stress will occur when two individual conditions are met. One, individual जो है, he perceives the threat to his important needs and motives. There is some kind of threat to my survival, for example. And another is when he or she is unable to cope with the stressor, that I'm not able to find out the strategy that I can use and come out of the stress. So perceived threat, to experience stress, one must perceive that environment poses a threat to personally important needs. As I said, I fear my protection. I'm not secure. I'm not protected in a given environment. Or for example, okay, if not this, when you have an exam, तो अक्सर बच्चों में ये देखा जाता है कि उनके some kind of acidity level increases. They say we have a stomach ache or loose stomach or some other kind of a thing. And the coping ability, now this refers to the ability to cope with any unpleasant stimuli. So अगर दोनों ही नहीं है, one is you have developed that threat, and then you are not able to cope up. So of course you will fall into stress. That's it for today, discussing mental health, illness, classification, models, and different models of stress. That's it for today. I hope you all have been very vigilant to what I spoke. Must have written something or the other.
Thank you, ma'am.
ठीक है sir. Okay जी, thank you.
Thank you.